rounds of trade negotiations with tariffs back and forth. China and the United States have made what they call substantial progress in the latest talks. What can we expect as a result of that progress? Can a partial agreement bring an end to the prolonged trade war? And what will better China U.S. interaction mean for the rest of the world? To discuss these issues and more, I'm pleased to be in Singapore to talk to Cheng Li, Director and Senior Fellow of the John Thornton China Center of the Brookings Institution. And when we come back, I'll be talking to Kishore Mahbubani, Distinguished Fellow of the Asia Research Institute of the National University of Singapore. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Wang Mengmang. Now, 13 rounds of negotiations have finally brought Beijing and Washington closer to signing a deal. Details are still emerging, and there's a great deal of technicalities at this stage. Will it work this time?
I think there's a very good chance it will work out. I think, of course, that the previous rounds, including the 13th round, the day before, there are a lot of concerns. And when Vice Premier Liu arrived in Beijing, he received a gift about the 28 companies on the entity list. There's a lot of rhetorics, I mean, very hostile. But I really congratulate Liu He, despite all this criticism, fair or unfair or whatever. And he determined to go back to negotiation table, and the result was actually quite good. And I think it's fair to say that both sides, the Chinese side and American side, are pretty happy with the result. Again, that I think that it's also important in the context that Vice President Pence delivered a speech at the Wilson Center just a few days ago. Of course, there's some rhetoric similar to his speech a year ago, but there's some very interesting changes in his speech. He talked about the United States will never decouple with China. It's not the U.S. interest to contain China's rise. He also said that when we talk about the competition, we should not forget there's some areas of cooperation. And finally, he also specifically mentioned that the educational, cultural, and the tourism exchanges will continue. And of course, he mentioned about China should change its own economic behavior. This is the message that, again, they hope that China will, pay attention to U.S. demand on the economic front. I mean, my view is China is willing to compromise on trade front, but China is not willing to compromise on the national security or the issues of Taiwan or Hong Kong, and or in terms of technological front, in terms of the case of Huawei. So that actually is a very, very important message, and from the Vice President, I think it largely reflects the President's view.
Will those issues you just mentioned be some other areas of contention, even though that the two sides have agreed to come to truce on the trade dispute?
Well, of course, that the Washington environment and the overall environment is not so good, and the nationalism is still on the rise, and the Americans is entering the election season, and the mainstream views, the media's or political establishment is quite critical of China. So we should put in that background. But not, despite all this, I mean, we should really pay attention to some positive sign from represent the White House, President and Vice President, and I think these messages I mentioned is important. So my view is on the trade front, there will be substantial progress, or even you can see a comprehensive deal, not a mini deal. It's still possible. But of course, this will not resolve the tensions on the technological front, on the national security front, and on the political ideological front. No, but on the other hand, if without a trade deal, without what Chinese call the foundation of U.S.-China relation, I think that it's really bad news. So in that regard, I think the trade deal is important, and otherwise the two countries will be completely decoupled. So that's not the direction that China wants. It is also not the direction President and Vice President want to go.
Why do you think the two countries have been able to agree substantially this time? Can we say that the changing dynamics of the negotiations have been affected by the changing dynamics of their internal politics?
Well, some observers in China believe that the trade war, which lasted 1 year and 7 months, hit the U.S. badly. I actually do not feel that way. I think it may hit the agriculture sector. So because these products, the beans, you cannot, store, you should sell to China immediately. In that regard, there's some concern. And also, U.S. business group and companies, they feel that first of all, they wanted the president to give some pressure on China into market access, intellectual property rights, and etc. But they did not realize the trade war lasts for 1 year and 7 months. So they become anxious. They may, through media, express their concern. You do see the increased coverage on the U.S. side. But I do not see that the American public or business group become so desperate, including president. I think this is to do with 2 factors. One is president think that he needs China help in terms of North Korea, nuclear non-proliferation. He also wanted to claim that his pressure on China yields some positive result on the trade front.
So his first concern is security.
Correct, correct. You can see also from Vice President Pence's speech that because under his political kind of crisis which is going on, he faced the biggest challenge in the past 3 years after he became president, which is impeachment. Partly, he also alienated the Republican establishment because of the withdrawal in the troops.
Since you mentioned this impeachment proceedings and the upcoming elections are really tying President Trump's hands, so is that why the U.S. side has agreed to this preliminary deal?
No, I mean, this is one reason I just
Partly.
mentioned that, right, because he probably will later on play the card of peace, not card of war, regarding North Korea. That's actually, it will be a major move if he goes that direction. But you can see from his withdrawal in Syria, in the Middle East, caused a lot of criticism. But that actually is the disengagement into military, stationing in other countries. That reflects his overall foreign policy objective. So that's part of the reason. But another part of the reason is that it's from the a lot of critics think that it is one thing to criticize China in terms of so-called state capitalism or made in China 2025. Actually, I noticed the Chinese side no longer talk about the term made in China 2025. It is one thing to criticize these kind of things, and it is one thing also to be maybe disappointed with China. But it's quite another thing to have a comprehensive decoupling with China. That will not work.
That would be damaging.
Hurt the U.S. interests, right? It does not make sense to end the student visa with China, which was discussed last year in White House. It's very close to the president will sign that document to ban Chinese students. There's also some of the things is really too obsessed, but even from the political establishment. So there's adjustment in that regard.
Mm-hmm. So do you think this is a very important time for China and the U.S. to think about how far they've come over the past 40 years and to reflect on the differences as well as the hard times that they've had and to cherish what they've come through?
Well, I think for China, it should have better understanding the outside world, especially the United States, why they are so critical of China. There are a lot of legitimate reasons, but some of them probably based on misunderstanding. And some probably it's nothing to do with China, to do with the budget concern in the United States, and also maybe also the concern about how president will, whether he will be effective to deal with China. These are all important factors. Probably only a small number of people really want to contain China. But even those people want to contain China have that based on 2 different reasons. One is think China is very strong. We should contain China before too late. And probably U.S. only have 5 to 10 years to contain China, because in some crucial areas like 5G, AI, and quantum computing, and China will catch up. And China also militarily probably also will become stronger and stronger, and especially in the time frame of a couple of decades. The other, actually, the people who want to contain China is based on just the opposite. China is so weak, and so we can afford punish China without cost. So even that group has a different view. It's a small group. So it's a very complicated phenomenon. I hope that the Chinese policymakers and the scholars should have a understanding about the complexities of American politics and American views of China. But at the same time, the best thing is for both China and the United States to improve their own governance at home, and also pay attention for the issues of have and have-nots within China, and also outside the world in the global perspective. Now, one thing I think China certainly has been doing very well is the poverty reduction. Also by next year, well, it's really poverty elimination. That actually is a wonderful achievement for China over the past 40 years. And but at the same time, a lot of grievance or concern on the United States is because American middle class did not develop that much over the past 20 or 30 years. Now, of course, the reason is complicated. As someone said, it's a part of the economic globalization only benefit the top 20%, or someone said that because of American lifestyle or American economic structure and etc. But the fact is that this economic disparity increased in the United States. So those 80% people did not benefit much over the past 30 years, whether it be because of economic globalization or American economic structure, and this is debatable, but that's a fact why President Donald Trump won the election 3 years ago.
So this prolonged trade war between China and the U.S. have had some really strong spillover effect on a global scale. There's this domino effect, we should say, for smaller economies as well. So how important is it for both sides to reach an agreement to stop this trade war? Why is it important for them as well as the other countries and regions?
Well, of course, this is the second and the first largest economy in the world. I think that will affect the region. I think this conference, in Singapore, certainly reflects other countries' concern about the global economy. This is precisely Vice Premier Liu He said in the White House, when he met with President, this is not about the trade between two countries. It's about the peace and prosperity of the entire world. But on the other hand, China certainly wants to have a deal because as a country still, relatively speaking, have a significant portion of the exports. I think China certainly wants. But of course, the United States ultimately, I think that it's a business group and its companies still think China is a huge market, and to a certain extent it's complementary to each other in terms of financial sector reform, and also in terms of the huge in the public health area and retirement age group and urbanization. And these are all great opportunities for American companies. So again, there's a need to have that trade deal, but the need is beyond the economic reason.
All right. Thank you so much,
Sure,
Mr. Li.
Sure, yeah.
Professor Kishore Mahbubani, welcome to Dialogue.
My pleasure.
The negotiators from both China and the United States used slightly different rhetoric to describe where they are at the stage. The Americans say that they've agreed on a substantial phase 1 of a trade deal, while the Chinese say that they've made progress in some areas, substantial progress on some areas. Now, does the difference in wording matter, and is a deal within sight?
There is both a tactical game being played and a long-term strategic game being played. So there are wins and losses in the tactical side and wins and losses on the strategic side. So you've got to be clear which game you are watching. So quite often the United States is focused on short-term tactical wins. China is focused on the long-term strategic gains. So these are two different games that are being played. So whether or not there is a deal in the short term, right? It'll be good. It'll be good if it happens. But that's not the real issue. The real issue is how the long-term game is going to be played out. And this is something that I find that the United States hasn't given enough care and attention to thinking about what the final result will be like, right? Now, if the goal of some of these Americans is to stop China from progressing further, they will fail.
Now, this different way of thinking, will that lead to perhaps maybe could that give the U.S. an upper hand in the short term?
Well, it is possible that the United States may have an upper hand in the shorter term because, number one, it has a bigger economy. Number two, it has a trade deficit with China. China has a trade surplus, so in theory, China could lose more. But don't forget that this is not being driven by only economic considerations, but also political considerations. So in China, the leaders of China don't have to worry about any elections in 2020. President Trump has to worry about getting re-elected in 2020. And it's now becoming clear that if there's a major breakdown in the U.S.-China trade talks, and if the confidence in the markets goes down, and if economic growth in America slows down even more, it'd be bad for President Trump.
Actually, anything can be leveraged in China-U.S. relations when things go bad. Yes. Now, we kept talking about this win or lose situation, but does it have to be that way?
Well, sadly, it doesn't have to be a win-lose situation, because economics at the end of the day is a win-win game. So if you make your economy bigger, it doesn't mean that my economy has to be smaller. Your economy can grow bigger, my economy can grow bigger too. And that's what should be the nature of trade negotiations. That should be a win-win game. But sadly, in some ways, for reasons I find difficult to understand, President Trump doesn't understand economics 101 of international trade. Seriously. That tariffs are always bad. Tariffs undermine countries, undermine economic growth, right? But he thinks tariffs are good, right? But hopefully, I hope that there'll be enough people around him to persuade him that maybe you should try to achieve a deal, because that will be good for America, and if it's good for China, it can also be good for both of them.
Mm-hmm. And right now, negotiators are working on the technical consultations of part of the agreement text that have been broadly completed, and they've never come this far. So do you think a partial agreement will mean a breakthrough to this ongoing trade war, prolonged trade war?
Yeah, if you have been watching this trade war very carefully, you notice it goes up, it goes down, it goes up, it goes down, it goes up, it goes down. So I predict that there'll be many more ups and downs. So this is not the end of the game. But even frankly, temporary ceasefire, which is what this agreement is, it's a ceasefire, a truce. That also will be good for the markets and good for all of us, because as the IMF has documented, the continuation of the U.S.-China trade war is not just bad for the U.S. economy and Chinese economy, is bad for the global economy as a whole. And the 6 billion people living outside the United States and China are also going to be damaged by this trade war.
It's been really damaging. The supply chains have been affected, and businesses are putting off their decisions. So I want to get your thoughts on other countries' reactions to this temporary truce. What could it mean to the rest of the world?
I think most countries should be relieved, because the sense of uncertainty is, as you know, as you yourself indicated, affecting business decisions. And people who want to make investments don't want to make investments in a cloud of uncertainty. They want to have a certain degree of stability and calm in which they're going to make their investment decisions. So I think everybody will be very happy, even if there's only a temporary ceasefire in the trade dispute between the United States and China.
And some people tend to see the trade war as one of those periodic events where China and the U.S. will have to learn to manage their differences. Do you envision more in the future?
Well, I wish I had some good news for you, but as I mentioned to you, I've just finished writing a book on U.S.-China relations with a somewhat provocative title called Has China Won? And there's a kind of a paradoxical theme of the book, which is that the U.S.-China geopolitical contest is both inevitable and avoidable. So in the next few years, or even the next decade, there'll be a multi-dimensional contest between the United States and China in the economic sphere that we have already seen, in the political sphere, in the military sphere, in the cultural sphere, and even what I call the primacy sphere. So it's a multi-dimensional geopolitical contest. And this trade war is only a small part of a very complex geopolitical game that is going to be played out between the United States and China. And we should be looking at the whole picture and not just focus on one small dimension.
Now, out of this complexity, can all these issues be addressed separately, or do they have to be intertwined together?
I think the reality is that they are intertwined. And I'll give you a very simple example. As you know, right, America has never been so polarized as it is today. Everything that Trump does, the Democrats oppose, except for one issue. When Trump launched his trade war with China, the Democrats said, "We are with you." They're completely united. So why are the Democrats supporting Donald Trump on a somewhat irrational trade war? Because they are disillusioned with China on the political front. And a former Assistant Secretary of State who used to work for President Obama, for Hillary Clinton, Kurt Campbell, came out with an article in the magazine Foreign Affairs saying, we Americans, especially we Democrats, thought that if there's greater engagement, economic engagement between the United States and China, China would become more like America. But China is not becoming more like America. And so that's political disappointment. But the political disappointment is affecting attitudes of Democrats towards the trade war. So all these issues are therefore interlinked. And you have to see the whole picture.
But some say that because President Trump has his hands full dealing with the impeachment proceedings and the upcoming elections, he will be more focused and preoccupied with domestic agenda instead of this trade war with China.
I should confess that I have great difficulty understanding President Donald Trump. He is the most unpredictable American president I have ever studied. So he can do things, he can do things that are completely surprising, like go to the demilitarized zone and meet President Kim of North Korea. No other American president would dream of doing that, right? And then he can go to the other extreme and then completely confront Iran and actually launch a strike against Iran and then pull it back. Now this is very unpredictable behavior. Both these events I mentioned are real. They happen. They're unpredictable. So that's the nature of President Trump. And I guarantee you this, he will surprise us again.
There could be more uncertainty.
With some remarkable thing you'll do.
And Professor, talking about understanding, you just came back from an international conference to promote understanding about China. And this meeting is important because despite China's continued efforts to make clear of its intentions, the messages are still misread by some countries. Why is that? And why is it important for China to repeat this message of this peaceful rise?
I think it's important for China to understand why other countries have become concerned about China. And this is despite the fact that China has been very peaceful, right? China is the only major power that hasn't fought a war in 40 years, that hasn't fired a single bullet across its border in 30 years. China has genuinely been peaceful, and the rise of China has been peaceful. But at the same time, in 1980, in purchasing power parity terms, China's GNP was 10% of the United States. Now China's GNP is bigger. So when you suddenly become bigger, it's like being in a room next to maybe a small animal like a cat, and then after a while you realize a cat has become an elephant. And so you get, oh wow, I'm now living next to an elephant.
It's hard to perceive that truth.
So it's important for China to understand that because it's become so big, so quickly, there is therefore some concern. And this is not a concern just by China's neighbors, but also around the world. And that's why a conference like Understanding China is a very important conference. Because when, like the former president of Mexico was there, the former prime minister of Greece was there, the former prime minister of Belgium, the former president of Bulgaria, when you have such influential leaders coming together, they help to send a message to the rest of the world. This is how you should understand China.
China is undergoing another stage of reform and opening up, and Singapore has been a prime example for China to learn from in the past. Now, what do you think Singapore has to offer for today's China to take reference from?
Well, I mean, it's important. I'm a Singaporean. I think most Singaporeans are aware that Singapore is very small. There are only 5 million people in Singapore. China is 1.4 billion people. It's very limited what Singapore can offer to China. But nonetheless, it's a fact that when Mr. Deng Xiaoping came to Singapore in 1978, he did learn some things from Singapore. And it's a fact that continued engagement between Singapore and China is good for both countries. And Singapore, as you know, has participated in some very specific urban projects in Suzhou, in Tianjin, in Chongqing. And these are the small kinds of contributions that Singapore can make, because it is in Singapore's interest to see China succeed and prosper and grow.
Of course, and we look forward to seeing that. Thank you so much, Professor, for your insight.
My pleasure.
Appreciate it.